is Maren McRae, and I'm a university professor at the University of Waterloo. Today, I'll be speaking on is the right time, right place enough for phosphorus management, summarizing what's been learned from field research. So Lake Erie has a long history of water quality problems. Now we know that there were dramatic improvements in water quality during the 1980s and the 1990s, and these were really driven by improvements in wastewater treatment. And since that time, Lake Erie has undergone a period of reeutrophication over the past, say, 20 years. And today, non-point sources are the dominant sources of phosphorus into Lake Erie. And we know that agriculture is supplying a lot of that phosphorus. Now, we have been applying BMPs, or beneficial management practices, throughout the watershed, but things are really not getting better, or they're not getting better fast enough. Some of this is going to be related to climate. Some of it is because there's what's called legacy phosphorus that's in the watersheds that's going to take time to flush out. But some of it might also be that we're not doing enough in terms of BMP adoption and use, or that we're not maybe using the right BMPs in the right places. And so we want to make sure that we're being strategic and using the practices that are going to have the best effect depending on where we live. I'm going to talk about some of that today. So let's talk about BMPs, or beneficial management practices, in water quality. There are different things that farmers can do to reduce phosphorus losses from their farms. And some of these are more effective than others. But at the same time, some of them have been shown to improve conditions under certain conditions, but they might be less effective under other conditions, or they might even have what we call unintended consequences. So instead of making things better, they might make things worse if they're not used in the right landscape. So we need to make sure that we're using BMPs that are going to have an effect. Now, the problem is that a lot of our knowledge of agricultural BMPs has been learned through the growing season, sort of when your crops might be on their fields. And we don't really understand what's happening under winter conditions. And so this is something that's fairly poorly understood. And so when we do understand things about winter conditions, that's often extrapolated from maybe areas with more severe winters. So that might, for example, be something like the Nordic countries or the Canadian prairies. And so they have a lot more severe winters than we might have in Southern Ontario. So the thing about Ontario is we are temperate, but we do have cold conditions. We have winter processes. They're just not quite as severe as some of these other regions that have done a lot of winter work. So we need to make sure that we are using things that are just right for where we live. In the past, folks have asked me, what should we do to reduce phosphorus on our fields? And often what I've told people, and what others have told people, is that there's no silver bullet. You know, this idea of everybody, wants a silver bullet. What's the one thing I can do? And we've said, there isn't really one thing that you can do. And we say, do as many as you can because they work together. So this is this idea of stacking BMPs. And that we know that if every little one does a little bit, every one of the things you do does a little bit, together they'll do a lot. But we also recognize that there is a cost to BMP application, and simply stacking more and more and more on top of each other, hoping that at least some of them are going to work, isn't necessarily fair. Because we have to remember that there is a cost to employing these BMPs, and this is either there's a financial cost, or there are costs just in terms of logistics and challenges. And so asking people just to keep doing things that might not work so well or might lead to unintended consequences, that isn't terribly fair as well. So what we're really trying to do is optimize BMP selection so that people, you may only be able to do 2, 3, maybe 1. BMP on your farm, you want to make sure that what you do choose is going to be the best for your situation and have a really good effect. And you don't want to, if you only have the ability to do 1 or 2 BMPs, you don't want to have chosen the ones that aren't really going to work. So we really need to be strategic as in terms of what we ask people to do for BMPs on their. So I've been talking about using the right BMP for the right place. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with climate. Okay, so here we have a map of the Lake Erie watershed. And when we think about climate variability, we often think about regional differences. Like you might think about Winnipeg and Texas or North Carolina versus Ontario. But really, when you think about the Great Lakes region and the Lake Erie watershed themselves, there's often differences that exist within our own watershed that can be really important to water quality and the efficacy of BMPs. So from a precipitation, so that would be rain and snow, from a precipitation perspective, there are some dry and some wet areas. So we can see annual precipitation up on the left, mean annual temperatures on the upper right, growing degree days on the bottom left, and snow cover duration days. So those are the number of days where we actually have snow cover on the ground. And so, you know, certainly from a precipitation perspective, there are some dry and wet areas, but things are for the most part pretty similar. But we do see that more of our precipitation happens as snow towards the northeast than it does in the southwest. And we also know that we have snow on the ground for a lot longer in the northeast than we do in the northwest. So the snow comes and it stays, southwest, northeast and southwest. So in the northeast, the snow comes and it stays for longer, whereas in the southwestern end, you may get snow, but we often see a complete loss of a snowpack multiple times throughout the winter. In terms of temperatures and growing degree days, certainly the southwestern end of Lake Erie is warmer overall than the northeast, and it has a longer growing season. Now, not only do we see these little subtle differences in climate, what about the landscape? So if you walk around, you know, if you walked around the Upper Grand River or Upper Thames compared to, say, down towards Windsor, Essex, and Chatham, really the lay of the land is pretty different. So we can see differences in our landscape. So the top right shows us our elevation. We see slope in the bottom left. And then we also see soil texture, so soil type in the top left. And in the bottom, this is a map that's really showing the post-glacial activity. So basically where a lot of the soils that are there now, how that was formed, their sort of geological history. But the idea is that when we put all of this together, we know that in areas like the Upper Thames and Middle to Upper Grand, we really get into this sloping ground that tends to be coarser textured soils. And then once you get down towards Windsor, Essex, Chatham, Leamington, we really have very flat soils that tend to be clay soils. So really the lay of the land can be different between these different regions within our very own Lake Erie watershed. We also see differences in land use and the extent of tile drainage. So a minute ago, I talked about the extent of clay and the fact that we see more flat clays down towards the southwest. And then as we go towards the northeast, you get more sloping soils that are coarser in texture and maybe more well drained. Well, you can see this in the extent of tile drainage, because you can see with the maps on screen, the red is showing you that a very high proportion of that land is tile drained as you get down into that southwestern end. And then as you move away from that southwestern end towards the northeast, we see less and less tile drained land. Notice throughout the watershed that corn-soy rotations seem to dominate But once you get into Ontario, we really, especially towards the northeast, we definitely see more wheat in the rotation. It's interesting to see that in the really sloping ground in the United States towards Michigan or New York and Pennsylvania, that a lot of that sloping ground tends to be used for pasture. So when we put all of these differences together, we binned them all, what we came up with was a classification system for different management zones in the Lake Erie watershed. And so that's what you can see with the map on the screen. We don't get clear distinctions in terms of zones, but we see two sort of general zones emerging, the northeast, which is shown in blue, and the southwest, which is shown in red, but then we have some sort of transitional areas in the middle. So the transition north and the transition south, meaning that they're not a clean boundary. So when we start to think about the climate, things like snow melt versus having no snow, when we start to, or not no snow, but less snow and periods without snow cover, when we think about flat clays versus sloping loamy soils, we start to think about the fact that this may actually have implications for how phosphorus is moving from farm fields. And because of this, this might have implications for how we might strategically manage those phosphorus losses, which is really going to be the next portion of my presentation. So what we might, first of all, how is phosphorus leaving the field? So we know that oftentimes, phosphorus losses have been associated with surface runoff and overland flow. This has been known for a very long time. Keep that soil on your field because a lot of, when you have that soil erosion, particulate, sediments leaving your field, they're just charged with phosphorus, and it's a major, major source. And so people used to think if you could just get it underground, that would solve all of your problems. But then it's emerged that tile drains are actually a very important pathway for both water loss, but also in certain settings, phosphorus loss. So tile drains, people don't think of them as a phosphorus pathway, but they can actually be really important. But the relative proportions, so the way it's partitioned between the surface and the subsurface, really differs depending on where you live. So what we have on screen here are how are runoff and phosphorus lost from fields, and does this vary regionally. And so we actually have 3 sites that we looked at over actually close to an 8-year period, but this is showing about 4 or 5 years of data averaged together or added all together. And so what we see at one site is in Loughborough, one is in Ilderton, which is near London, and the last one is in Essex. So the Essex is a clay soil, it's a Brookston clay, whereas the Ilderton is a silt loam and Loughborough is a clay loam, maybe silty clay loam. And so what we can see is that in terms of their soil test P, they're all in the 11 to 16 range of the bicarb or Olsen P. So that's what we see in the top 15 centimeters of soil. So they're not that different in terms of their soil test P, but what we see from these pie charts is that the pies are showing you in blue what is lost in the tile, and the orange is showing you what's lost in the surface. And on the left-hand side, you can see water. So this is just the volume of flow. And then we see dissolved phosphorus and total phosphorus on the right. So that dissolved phosphorus, it's sort of like, almost like you would think of tea. So it's dissolved in the water, and you can't necessarily see it, but that doesn't mean that it's not there. Total P often shows up more as that sort of turbid chocolate milk kind of water, but it doesn't always look that way, but it can. So essentially what you can see is that in any given year, most of the water is lost in tile drainage, and only a small amount in the grand scheme of things is lost in surface runoff. And so we know that a lot of it is really leaving through these tile drains. And so tile drains from a runoff perspective are doing what they're supposed to be doing. But when we look at the dissolved phosphorus and the total phosphorus, we see a bit of a difference. So Ilderton, you have to think about, Eelderton, what we tend to see is that it's a very hummocky, flat. So although it's a silt loam, it tends to be hummocky and flat, and the road beside the site kind of impacts any runoff from leaving the site. It kind of forces things down through the tile. So it's kind of no small wonder that they don't get a lot of surface runoff at this site. But when we look at the Lonsborough site that has more sloping ground and the ability for that water to just run off at the edge of the field, we can see that although most of the water leaves through the tile, actually a lot of the phosphorus losses are actually in a very small proportion of the runoff. So the surface runoff is a very important pathway for phosphorus at this site. When you go to Essex, on the other hand, really what we lose in the tile versus what we lose in the surface in terms of phosphorus, they're pretty proportionate to runoff. So and so what we see is that our concentrations in surface runoff are often much higher at our Lonsborough and Eelderton sites, whereas our concentrations in Essex between the surface and the tile tend to be more similar. Now, they can see some surface erosion in the Essex sites, and this often happens especially during snowmelt. So when we think about that surface runoff and when it's happening, and just tile flow in general, we see that most of our phosphorus losses are happening during peak flow, typically during the non-growing season, which happens between October and April. And so we see at our Lonsborough, and the same is true for our Eelderton site, that it often happens where we can get tiles that flow often throughout the entire non-growing season. So this is a 3-year period. So they're flowing throughout the non-growing season, and so we can see during these very wet periods that tile flow and surface flow are happening together. Essex, it's also happening with surface runoff and tile drainage are also, we definitely see peak flow conditions, but notice that it kind of can happen throughout the entire year at our Essex site. So still most is with the non-growing season, but it's not quite as exaggerated, and they are more vulnerable to phosphorus losses during the summer when they get these very strong convective storm events that can roll through, and phosphorus can then leave both in the surface and in tiles. So when we start to think about conservation practices that are going to work effectively between these different regions, we're going to find that some of them are going to work very, very well everywhere, whereas other ones have to be used with caution, and they might perform better in some landscapes and not as well in other landscapes. So this is what I want to move into next. So we've all heard of the 4 R's nutrient stewardship strategy. So this is where we use the right source, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. And so while this is a concept, this is great. The question is, what are the specific practices that are tied? So what is the right practice that you would tie to each of these? And that practice might differ. So the first place that I'd like to start is applying phosphorus at the right rate. What you can see on the screen is some graphs that are showing you soil test P on the X, soil test P on the X-axis, and DRP, or dissolved reactive phosphorus, concentrations and loads on the Y-axis. And the same is true here, where what we've done is we've ordered the sites from low soil test P. So this is about the ones on the far left are 5 milligrams per kilogram, and the ones on the right are 25, and the others are sort of in that 11 to 16 range. And these are showing you concentrations of total phosphorus and dissolved reactive phosphorus at these study sites. And so this is Ontario. We see Ontario on the left, Ohio on the right, and we see Manitoba on the bottom right. And so the Manitoba study is showing that when we decreased the soil Olsen P concentrations, there was a reduction or a lessening in the phosphorus losses from those sites simply by drawing down that soil P. So the bottom line is that the higher your soil P is, the more vulnerable you are to losing phosphorus from those systems. And so drawing down those I understand that you have to keep agronomically, you need to keep the levels to what is appropriate agronomically, but what you really want to avoid is over applying to some fields, and that often happens in livestock areas, and not always, but it can happen in livestock areas. And so some of that is trying to figure out ways to spread that manure out over more fields, bigger areas, broader areas, so that you don't end up going back to the same fields over and over, because when you build those soils up, you really increase their potential for losing phosphorus. So getting that soil P down and maintaining it at low levels, or just what you need agronomically, is probably the first line of defense, and this is something that is going to work everywhere. What about applying phosphorus at the right time? This is a quick graph that I whipped up to look at cumulative runoff losses, and on the x-axis you can see month of the year. So there's February is 2, and May is 5, October is 10, and then of course you get December towards the end. And I've really highlighted in these are just different sites that we've done research at. Some of them are in Ohio and some of them are in Ontario. But essentially we're trying to look at when the runoff losses are happening within a given, in terms of periods of time throughout the year. And what you can see is that if you actually look at when most of the runoff is happening, we get some in the January, February associated with melts, but oftentimes it's that March, April, May. That is when a lot of our annual losses are happening. And so this is shown for the years 2013, 14, and 15. So this is showing you that you're getting variability because every year is different, but in general, most of our losses are really happening in those spring months. And then we also see that it gets quite dry during the summer. And although you can have some storms that are significant in some years, for the most part, it's really quiet during the growing season. And so then it gets wet again in the fall. So if we had to look at the Goldilocks time from a water quality perspective to apply nutrients, applying it during these drier periods, avoiding those wet periods, is the best thing that you can do, because then they have more time to be stabilized in the soil. So the earlier we can get things onto the fields in the fall is a good idea if you're going to fall apply, or if you can apply it in spring at the time of planting, that is optimal, because you're just applying it ahead of the period. Now, what about the other thing that I'd like to talk about is applying phosphorus at the right time. Here we have an example of some 2014 to 15 at one of our field sites, the Eilderton field site. And what we can see is we have dissolved reactive phosphorus and total phosphorus concentrations in tile drainage, and we have runoff. And what we see is that when fertilizer and manure, well, there was fertilizer with a strip till applied with a bit of manure. When that was applied, notice that our concentrations in our tile drainage jumped considerably, and they stayed high. So this isn't throughout, and then they started to go down again towards the spring. But the idea is, what we're trying to do is disconnect this hot period with the time of a lot of runoff. So if you can avoid applying things around wet periods, it's a good idea. And the other thing is, never ever apply manure on frozen ground, on snow. From a compaction perspective, I know that people like to get on the fields to get rid of that, or put it on the fields and avoid compaction. The problem is that when that snowmelt happens, that manure is washed straight off of the fields and into waterways. And so from a water quality perspective, applying on frozen ground is probably the worst thing that you can do, and it should absolutely be avoided. Now, what about applying phosphorus in the right place? So this is sort of the potential for nutrient placement. So from a fertilizer perspective, what we did is, Kirsten Grant is a former master's student of mine. Kirsten looked at some soil columns where she looked at silt loam soil and a clay soil, and she looked at things that were unfrozen and frozen, and these were no-till soils, and she applied phosphorus and nitrogen as a broadcast or as a band, and she tracked what came out of the bottom of her soil columns or soil cores. And what she found is that when you banded that fertilizer, it disconnected that fertilizer from the preferential flow paths that tend to happen in soils. And this was most pronounced in the clays, but even when you had frozen conditions in the silt loam. So what you're doing is you're disconnecting the source from the pathways. And she actually found that the application, just putting things as subsurface bands, reduced her winter nutrient losses and drainage by 60%. And this was both for phosphorus and for nitrogen. So what about manure? So if tillage, in some cases, people apply manure and then till, but in some situations, people will do a gentle till and then apply the manure on top of that. So it just depends on what you're using. And so in this particular case, we were in a silt loam soil where the farmer was, he did a gentle a gentle conservation till, so a shallow till. Then he applied liquid dairy manure. And so what he did is, we had one plot was tilled, so our A plot in green was tilled, and then in our our second ones, we had both were conservation till, but in the middle one, which is the purple one, he went back and he incorporated that. So he did a second shallow till after he had applied the manure. And what we found is, and he only incorporated it in the second year of study. So in the first year of study, he just broadcast on, or not broad, but he applied it on the surface after he conservation tilled these two plots. And so what we actually found is that they really didn't differ, these two plots, but we found that when he incorporated the manure, it actually reduced the phosphorus losses in tile drainage at that site. But it wasn't during every event. It tended to really be during the peak events when you have a lot of connection between the surface and the tile. So that was really typically snowmelt. So most of the time you didn't see it, but you saw it for the most important event of the year, such that when we tally up losses over the course of the year from those plots, incorporation really did make a difference. So if you are going to broadcast manure, if you can incorporate it gently, it's a good idea. So that brings me to the concept of tillage. So increases in soluble reactive phosphorus loads, or dissolved reactive phosphorus loads, in the southwestern end of Lake Erie have been related to increased no-till in tile-drained landscapes. And so we've heard this as an unintended consequence. So of course, this finding was pretty upsetting to farmers who had gone to no-till to keep their soil on their fields and reduce erosion and phosphorus loss, and had seen all of the benefits of no-till, and they were now questioning whether or not they should till up their soils. So we did some studies in Ontario to investigate this. So we had a couple of sites. These were both in Innisfil. One was 25 milligrams per kilogram as Olsen P, and the other was only 5 milligrams per kilogram. And so what you should notice first off is look at the difference in concentrations in the 25 milligrams per kilogram versus the 5 milligrams site. Really, before you even think about tillage, differences in soil test P are probably going to do more in terms of controlling phosphorus losses as a first line of defense. But now let's look at tillage. So what we had is we had a period for about the first year or year and a bit of the study where both were in no-till. And then in the second year, he tilled up these plots and he left these as his rotational till, or he's not a no-till, but it's a rotational conservation till where he uses a Salford unit. So it's very low disturbance. And we did not see, we expected that tillage was going to reduce phosphorus losses in our tile drainage, and it didn't. If anything, we saw more losses of particulate phosphorus. Didn't really do anything for dissolved phosphorus. So this site is really not doing what they have seen in Ohio when we think about tillage. So why might this be? Well, some of it has to do with the sites in Ohio where preferential transport takes different pathways. So the blue staining is showing you preferential flow in a clay versus a silt loam. So some of it is related just simply to the hydrology. But some of it might, in fact, be because he applies his fertilizer in bands in the subsurface. And a lot of the conclusions about no-till and phosphorus losses in tile drainage and clays have been where there was a broadcast. So we're not always comparing apples to apples, and this is an important detail when we start to think about what we should do. So we really want to go back to these spatial differences in terms of the effects of tillage. So let's pull together what we've seen. Should you till or not? A lot of the discussion around no-till has been around tile drainage, but we have to remember that no-till reduces phosphorus in surface runoff also. So let's look at how that phosphorus leaves the fields. 80% of the water is leaving in the tile drain and 20% in the surface. But for phosphorus in the Northeast, much of it is happening in surface runoff. Much of the phosphorus leaves in the surface and very little is leaving in the tile. Whereas in Essex, it tends to be more of the phosphorus is leaving through the tile drains because of that preferential flow. So we want to manage in the phosphorus in both the surface and the subsurface, but the subsurface is more vulnerable in the southwestern end, and the surface is more important in the northeastern end based on what we're seeing. So given that tillage didn't increase phosphorus losses in the northeast, and we know that most phosphorus is lost in surface runoff in those sloping grounds, a return to tillage would probably increase phosphorus losses because you'd lose more in surface runoff. So people should actually try to go to less till or no till to the most extent that they can in these landscapes. On the other hand, does that mean, what about the southwestern end? Should we till in the southwestern end? Well, we strongly believe that no-till is a great choice, but if you're a no-tiller, apply that nutrient in a subsurface band with seed at the time of planting is the best line of defense. If you must surface broadcast, leaving a surface broadcast on a clay soil in tile drain landscapes is going to make you certainly vulnerable to losing a lot of that phosphorus through the tiles. So in that, if you cannot put it in a band and you must surface apply, a very low disturbance, gentle incorporation is probably a good idea in the southwestern end, in the clays. So what about cover crops? Cover crops are another area that's been hotly debated. And these offer a lot of benefits, including a reduction in the losses of particulate phosphorus at the surface. And the photos on the screen show sediment in a surface runoff flume in fields with and without cover crops. And the individual wearing the boots, you can really see the mud sticking on their boots in the field that doesn't have a cover crop, and notice they can walk around quite comfortably on the cover cropped field. So a picture says a lot. The problem with cover crops is that they can increase phosphorus losses in springtime after they freeze in the winter. But much of the evidence for this is from study sites that are in the Canadian prairies or the Nordic countries that have much more severe winters than we do. So when we look at the graphs on the screen, in the Northern Great Plains, or NGP, which is sort of, I'm talking about Winnipeg sites here, and the Great Lakes region, we can see that we have more rain, but also more snow than they get in the prairies. And our temperatures, our air temperatures can get quite cold, as theirs do. Okay, so the red is showing you surface temperatures. We don't get as cold as they do, but we can definitely see some cold temperatures. But what we actually see is that we get these are their soils in the green, and ours are in the pink and blue. And what we see is that they get a lot more frozen soil than we do, and we don't see a lot of frozen soils around here. The reason for this has to do with the snow cover. We get a lot of snow cover around here that stays, especially in the northeastern end, as I mentioned earlier, that stays and insulates our soils so that you really, if you do get frost, it's pretty shallow and it's not significant. So not only do we insulate our soils with snow, this also insulates our crop residues and our cover crops. So in a snow-free area like the Northern Great Plains, they get snow, but they get very little snow, and a lot of it gets blown around because they're so flat. The crops can be really exposed to these very, very cold temperatures, where ours may see frost, but they don't see so severe frost. So we looked at cover crops and their potential for phosphorus losses following freeze-thaw cycles. And so James Kober looked at the difference between a gentle frost, so -4 to +4 degrees Celsius, which might be something that you would see inside the snowpack. And then he looked at -18 to +4 degrees Celsius. So this is a much more severe frost. So if you didn't have any snow cover, for example. And what he saw is that, yes, frost severity matters. And when you have modest frosts, like we have around here, especially in snow-covered regions, the plants can handle it without really releasing a lot more phosphorus, or a lot of phosphorus. When you're in an area that is snow-free, then you run the risk. But what we actually see is that you can manage your cover crop choices to lessen that risk. And so tender species like oilseed radish and oat that tend to winter kill, they lost a lot more phosphorus than, say, vetch, red clover, or cereal rye. So frost severity matters, but so does crop choice, cover crop choice. Another important feature is how much water is there on those fields, because essentially if you're in a low-lying area that's prone to flooding, the chances for those crops to lose more of that phosphorus is increased. So we can also optimize what we plant and where. So when we think about our regions in the Lake Erie watershed, the bottom two photographs are Essex County, and the bottom right are we've got Ilderton and Lonsborough. So all of these regions experience snow cover and snow-free periods, but Essex is more likely to lose its snowpack and then get those cold winter temperatures, whereas the Northeast, even though it's colder in general, in the Upper Thames and the Upper Grand, they're more likely to experience prolonged snow cover that insulates the soils and insulates the cover crops. And so we want to, and at the same time, we tend to see more flooded land like you see in the picture on the right-hand side, in the loamy soils in the Northeast, but we don't see them for as long in the southwestern end in those clays. So I think that cover crops are a net benefit in this landscape. They say in the prairies they make things worse for phosphorus, but in Ontario I don't think that's the case. I think cover crops are a good idea because we lose so much particulate phosphorus in the surface, and we get a lot of rain on snow or rain on mud during the fall and the springtime. But I think at the southwestern end we want to choose very carefully which cover crop species we plant because the risk of phosphorus losses are greater. Now, what about point sources? So in areas with livestock, sometimes, certainly we know to keep our cows out of the stream and want to have proper storage, and avoid applying around those wet periods or on frozen ground. But sometimes you can have point sources in the landscape. And so one thing that we don't tend to think about is our bunker silos. And so we did some research in a watershed that had a bunker silo located really close to the stream. And although that bunker silo, there was a little bit of leachate that would just trickle gently out of that bunker silo into a wetland before it entered into the stream. And we looked at phosphorus concentrations and loads upstream and downstream of that bunker silo over the period of a year. And the blue is showing you upstream, and the red is showing you downstream. And you can see when the bunker silo was refilled. And so what we actually found is that the bunker silo itself and even the wetland through which the bunker silo was flowing are actually acting as an important phosphorus source to the watershed. And the bunker silo and the adjacent wetland probably accounted for about 30% of the watershed soluble reactive phosphorus losses and 22% of the total phosphorus losses, particularly after it was refilled in July. So it's really important that we remember about some of these potential point sources with regards to the fact that they may be small and they may not be all over the place, but they can be important sources. And so we want to make sure that we're managing that effluent and not saturating the wetlands that they might flow into. And so we're working with this farmer in the future to modify this so that that silo doesn't release phosphorus to the surrounding waterways in future. So I'm really at the end. This is a summary diagram that the CSA News did because they liked a paper that we wrote that really covered much of what I talked about in today's talk. And they made this nice infographic that shows these different zones and what is maybe more and less optimal. So we really defined 5 steps for what are our next steps for this. And first is to refine our phosphorus management regions and maybe expand them to incorporate nitrogen management regions in the future. And what we want to do is work together with farmers, with government, CCAs, industry, to develop region-specific guidance for improved beneficial management practices or recommendations for fertilizer and manure application. And so this is something that we really want to develop region-specific guidance, and then we want to work with our partners to refine it, and we want to make sure that we're making recommendations that are good, that are useful to farmers, and that we're not asking people to do things that are logistically impossible. Fourth, we want to communicate our results to ensure that people are using the right practices in the right places. And then lastly, we need to have an adaptive management framework to detect and assess and mitigate any potential trade-offs that might happen in these different P management regions. So really, in closing, my send-off messages: regions throughout the Lake Erie watershed have different climates and landscapes, and this affects phosphorus loss throughout the watershed. Conservation practices can differ in their efficacy throughout the Lake Erie watershed, and because of that, we want to start to think about and develop phosphorus management zones that with general principles where practices may be more or less effective. And some practices are going to work really well everywhere, like things like keeping those soil phosphorus levels to a minimum, whereas and also the placement and the timing of that fertilizer, they're all going to be really important. Things like tillage and cover crops, the effects that it's going to have are going to depend on where you live, and it's not that something is going to be positive or negative in one landscape. It's more just that they have to be treated with a little bit more care so that we're using things properly and optimizing what we do to minimize phosphorus losses. With that, I would like to thanks to partners and funding agencies, and I look forward to chatting with some of you for questions.